Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics Podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism.
Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast. I'm Daniel, the host for the show. Today, we not only have a wonderful guest, but are very excited to welcome back Deepa Patel as today's dialogue partner.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Daniel. Nathaniel, who normally occupies this role of dialogue partner, will be back, but I'll be jumping in from time to time, and I'm happy to be on this journey with you all.
Lovely to have you. Thanks, Deepa. We've been wanting to manifest this for some time, and we're so happy it worked out for you to come on board in this capacity. I thought I'd have to wait a while for our next episode together, but here we are.
Yep, thank you. It's nice to be back, and I'm excited to dive in here.
Wonderful. Then without further ado, our guest for today is Sensei Joshin Byrnes, a Zen priest and teacher in the White Plum lineage of Maizumi Roshi and Bernie Glassman Roshi, and a Dharma successor of Roshi Joan Halifax, who in 2017 founded the Loaf Mountain Zen Community, a hub for community-engaged Zen practice in Vermont. Alongside his religious vocation, Joshin spent much of his career working for social change nonprofits in the areas of HIV/AIDS prevention, child welfare, homelessness, and community-based philanthropy.
Hey.
Welcome, Joshin.
Nice to see you. Yeah, thank you.
It's so nice to be with you.
Oh, Deepa, I'm so glad to reconnect with you.
Indeed.
And Daniel, really nice to meet you today.
You as well. So, for our topic, we have chosen the dialogue on the concept of cooking your life, meaning looking to cooking in the kitchen both as a metaphor for the spiritual path and as a direct arena for practice. In particular, we'd like to focus on this theme as it appears in Zen Buddhism and Sufism, the home traditions of Joshin and Deepa, respectively. To begin, Joshin, in a general way, what is your perspective on the Zen attitude towards cooking, both literally and metaphorically?
Well, of course, it all starts with my childhood, right? I grew up in this Italian-American family in Brooklyn, New York.
Molto bene.
Yeah, lots of excitement, lots of drama, lots of emotions around the dining room table, the kitchen table. And I have a very fond memory, actually, of my, everybody has an Italian grandmother, and I come from Brooklyn. And so my Italian grandmother making tomato sauce, which started early in the morning on Sunday morning before we all went to Catholic Mass. And you'd wake up to the smell of garlic and tomato paste and tomatoes getting going. And then by the time we all got home from Mass, the tomato sauce would be done and we'd be ready for this huge feast, just a huge feast. And we'd all be there. There were 6 kids in my family, my parents, aunts and uncles, cousins, my grandparents, and it's a madhouse, a delightful madhouse of cooking and food and eating and feelings. And I remember asking one time my grandmother, why are you cooking all day? Like, why do you do this? Like, it is so much work, why are you doing it?
Mm-hmm.
She says, I'm doing it because I love you.
Mm.
And, it's like, of course, what else is a grandmother going to say, right? I mean, but it was true, she cooked for love. And when I first discovered Dogen's teachings on instructions to the cook, of course, I read it through that lens,
Mm-hmm.
So Dogen, in 37 or so, wrote this little instruction for the head cook of the monastery. And the head cook of the monastery, by the way, is the second most important person in the monastery next to the abbot. It's considered a complete spiritual practice. And so he wrote this instruction. It's more than just a manual for the cook. It's really a manual for life and for living. And my take on it was, he's talking about cooking for love. That's really what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've loved this text. It's been a core practice for me when I was both the head cook during my training years. When we study Zen, I introduce people to Zen through this teaching. And it's very much the framework for our practice at Bread Loaf Mountain Zen community. Yeah, so it's a text that I love a lot. And I find it kind of bottomless in a way. I come back to it all the time, and there's so much more. Yeah.
Bottomless, like a nice big pot of soup.
Exactly. Yeah. Like tomato sauce. You never run out.
Yeah.
So beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. And just before we kind of go deeper into the instructions to the cook, because I have some questions kind of in that regard, just right here at the onset, Deepa, I wanted just to ask if you could share a little bit about the Sufi attitude towards the same thing, the literal and metaphorical practice of cooking.
Yeah, and maybe Daniel, because Joshin started where he did, it of course it invoked a memory of my own childhood and a very special grandmother.
Yeah.
As soon as you were talking about your grandmother, Joshin, the thing that came to my mind was that my grandmother was the person that when there was a wedding happening where we lived, she would be the person that would gather everyone to come and make all the pre-wedding food because, Indian weddings are very complicated. There's all kinds of things that are made that have to be exchanged between families. So if I was to think about where I learned about the power of cooking and community, it was from this very powerful woman who seemed to just be able to pick up the telephone and people would come and there'd be singing and the making of poppadoms and a number of other things, sweets. It's very nice to have that memory invoked again and to realize how cooking in the service of love, whether it's for community or weddings, is kind of, I just felt it very much in my DNA. And then a little bit like what you just said, the role of the cook within Sufism and Hinduism, the traditions that I grew up in, the role of the cook is very strongly linked to spiritual practice. Whether the cook, when you go to a teke, is often thought of as, like you said, the second in command.
Mm-hmm.
And, even within Hinduism, if you were going to get a cook, you would ask for a Brahmin cook to come and be the one that cooks for you. So I think that those are really interesting. That's something which is right at the heart and essence of life, food, that spiritual practice is so strongly connected to that in so many ways. So it's nice to remember those connections, actually.
Yeah, I love that. And that's part of what attracts me to this topic is the fact that it's part and parcel of everyday life in every culture and is such a rich arena. And so you both touched on more of the literal part of cooking. Can y'all share a little bit more about cooking as a metaphor for the spiritual path and what it means maybe to be cooked or to cook one's life? I believe it's Bernie Glassman who has this book that is somewhat of a commentary or inspired by the Dogen's text instructions to the cook of cooking your own life. Is that right, Joshin?
Yeah, so Uchiyama Roshi actually wrote a commentary on this text called Cooking Your Life, and Bernie Glassman wrote How to Cook Your Life, I think is what it was. And they both kind of see the metaphorical layer of meaning in this text, while it is really a instruction in so many ways. Dogen's getting a teaching across, as he does, sometimes directly and sometimes kind of indirectly. So as an example, Dogen talks a lot about how the cook doesn't get to choose the ingredients of their life or what's in the kitchen, that the cook walks into the pantry and uses what's there. And this is a lovely metaphor for your life. We don't get to choose a lot of what makes us who we are, our genetics, our childhood, our culture that we were born and raised in, our wounds, our bodies and the shape that they are, as we live our lives, as we grow old, we essentially inherit a pantry.
Mm-hmm.
And what a Zen cook does is asks themselves the question, okay, so how do I make something beautiful and nourishing, what Dogen calls the supreme meal, out of the ingredients of my life, where nothing's left out, where there is no such thing as garbage, where every single thing is used. Even Dogen talks about this, even the lettuce that's spoiled, that there's a place in the process of cooking for the rotten lettuce, for the pebbles that exist in the rice. Everything is treated as something precious. He even talks about the pots and pans in this way. He's like, you have to see the pot as your own head. You have to hold the rice as if it were your eyes. The water is your lifeblood. That's how precious it is.
Mm.
These are all metaphors for appreciating every single thing that is an ingredient of our lives. And what a beautiful metaphor, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, what you're just saying reminds me of this very sweet anecdote from this biography on Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, Crooked Cucumber. And in this scene, young Shunryu Suzuki Roshi is walking somewhere and there's a cart or a wagon filled to the brim with cucumbers. And some of the cucumbers are falling off of the wagon. And he's going and saving all of the cucumbers in the mud and wiping them off. And some of them are deformed or starting to go bad a little bit. And, he takes them and salvages them. And the whole scene is kind of permeated with this exquisite tenderness that feels like it conveys so much.
Sometimes, even when I remember this metaphor in Dogen's teachings, I come back really quickly to this question like, oh yeah, what would it be like to not see any part of my own life as garbage, as disposable, but everything as an opportunity to nourish myself, others, the world, that's an interesting practice challenge for me, because how often am I either literally in the kitchen where I think, oh, garbage, get rid of it, get it out of my sight in a way. That's not pretty. It doesn't smell good. It's not nice. It's not pleasant. How often do I do that in my life when I kind of come across the people I dislike, the politics I don't like, the situations of our world that really turn me off? What's it like to cook with that as opposed to push it away or try to get it into the garbage container somehow,
That feels like a perfect place, Joshin, to talk about. As I was thinking about our meeting, so much of what I've seen in the teachings has to do with the attitude with which we cook. How is it that we're going to cook? What is our energy at that time of cooking? And then you've just so beautifully and poignantly talked about, what do we do with what's considered to be rubbish, really? I'm struck by that whole thing about the attitude with which we cook, and I remember doing kind of spirituality 101 at the beginning of my journey, which was this idea that my attitude even affects the food that I'm cooking. And could I see that? And I remember being kind of in my 20s and going, okay, I'm going to cook this meal with love. Never having done it before, but wanting to kind of see what was that like? Because I don't think I'd ever really thought about the attitude with which I made something and how that does lead to an incredible process of unity, of even of oneness, where there's an emptying that goes on and there's a different relationship with each ingredient. But as you said, the pots and the pans, it had a really big influence on me to think about what it means that the attitude with which I cook has as big as an impact as anything else. And I kind of constantly feel that. And I was reading something about someone who's been doing Tai Chi. And he was saying that the more he's done Tai Chi, the more he can feel the sense of and the energy and the emotions and the thoughts of the people that he's surrounding himself with, including the people that cook. And how actually when we become that sensitive, that we really are present to each other and to all of the things that we consider to be objects, because that can be such a big part of cooking.
Oh, yeah.
That you're just seeing something as an object and not really being in relationship with it.
Yeah.
And I think that Sufism certainly has that, because the attitude there is really about the attitude of creating beauty.
Mm.
And if I think about particularly the Mevlevi tradition, everything in the Mevlevi tradition is kissed.
Oh.
You don't just put on a garment of clothes. And I was with this amazing student, and he literally was sitting next to a leaf that just kind of touched his top, and he bent, and very unconsciously, in terms of everyone around him, he just bent and kissed the leaf that had touched him, So I sort of see that as part of the attitude with which we cook. And I'm just taking on, what would happen if I actually kind of bent and kissed the parts of me that I don't think are worthy of love?
Right.
That suddenly really changes how I might show up.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the jobs I had, it was a brief gig, but for about a year, I ran the charitable foundation for a restaurant in Berkeley called Chez Panisse that was started by a celebrity chef named Alice Waters, who was like the grandmother of the local food movement. And I got to run her foundation for a while. And it was a lot of fun. There were a lot of aspects to it. But one time, I remember she was walking through the restaurant kitchen. The restaurant kitchens are high stress environments,
Yeah.
People work really hard. It's hot. They're working fast. And the chef was not in a good mood. And she was taking me through, and he was like chopping something. She went behind the kitchen line. She's like, what you put into that food gets eaten by the people you serve it to. Like what goes in, goes over to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to cook here with kindness, with love, with attention, with care, not with this kind of anger, because it goes into the food. She was really clear about this. And it reminds me of Dogen talks about the attitude too. He says there are these three minds, because, Buddhists and Zen people, they love to make lists of things, How many of that? The three minds. Mind is also called heart. It's the same word, heart minds. These three. The first is joyful mind. And he says this is the attitude of gratitude. And it's not a kind of superficial or fake cheer, but it's kind of the natural, quiet joy that says, I get to be here alive in this messy, sacred world with my hands in all the ingredients. Like that's joyful mind, just deep, abiding joy.
Mm.
The second attitude, he says, the Japanese word is roshin, grandmother's mind. And he says, this is the heart of the cook. It's like my grandmother who made the tomato sauce. Why are you cooking? I cook for love. This is grandmother's mind. And that's the mind that nurtures, that knows what others need, even before they ask. It's tender, it's kind, and it's also kind of fierce.
Like a grandmother.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it gives without needing recognition. This is grandmother's mind. And then the third attitude, Daishin, is magnanimous mind, big mind. And he says this attitude is the spacious heart. This is the part of us that can include it all, grief and celebration, mistakes and redemption and successes, big enough to hold complexity without clinging or rejecting any bit of it. This is the kind of mind that makes the table big enough for everybody, welcomes everyone, rejects no one.
Mm.
And so these are the attitudes of the cook, Dogen says, which again, talk about metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for practice, really. It's like, how do you orient your heart mind as a practitioner? And these are kind of qualities in some ways of the absolute in many ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's so rich.
Mm-hmm.
I have a flurry of little reflections on what you guys are saying. One, in terms of the vibrations that go into the food. I've thought about this often, of how home-cooked meals how they taste and how they feel. And people often speak to this like, oh, if only I could have a home-cooked meal, even if it may in some kind of objective sense be less delicious than some gourmet restaurant meal. There's a vibrational quality that nourishes, it seems, in a deeper way than something that is made through a commercial transaction. And what you were saying about these vibrations in the food, Deepa, is also making me think of prasad. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about that. Prasad, these gifts of food that are given out oftentimes by a teacher and is very explicitly a kind of medium for the transmission of some kind of blessing.
It's funny, Daniel. I'm thinking about the different times that I've eaten prasad, and as a child, and it was my favorite part of going with my grandma
Of course.
to her meditation class. You know, at the end, you'd sit there and put your hands out like this to receive this sweet thing that someone had taken time to make for you. And the eating of that was that kind of sense of eating divine food, taking that in and feeling it, in ingesting the divine. So that's a really strong tradition and carries on in Sufism. At every occasion, there's always that time that you make this sweet offering, that offering of nectar, as it were. And I'm thinking about, because we are looking at life on both levels, how often in a day we're offered prasad, right? It can be the smile and laughter of a child, or when you see that first sort of hint of spring. But I don't necessarily do that in the same way. I don't kind of stop and really ingest that in the way that I have taken prasad.
Right.
And I hope I can go this way, because this is where it's taken me. Is I'm very conscious of the fact that I will think of my taste buds when I'm eating food, but I don't always think of my taste buds when I'm sitting in a meeting. I don't kind of go, "Ooh, what am I tasting right now?" I've started to do that because I don't feel like I use my senses enough, right? To just become aware of what is that taste in my mouth as I'm sitting here. It might be a little bit of a pivot in the conversation that we're having, but I think it's all connected, because food really does bring in all of our senses, really, truly, in the way that, you know, you might have to touch whatever it is that you're making, you're looking, the colors, they're so important, you know.
Right.
I can't eat a plate of food which is one color. It just doesn't work for me. Do you know what I mean? So it's like this very interesting thing. And then even the sounds of it, like you talked about comfort food, that food that you can just take it in, there's no crunchiness to it or anything. But there's other times where that crunch is needed. Like, you know, I don't want to be without the crunch of life as much as of anything else. So I didn't really know that I was going to be talking about this here, you know, when I was thinking about
I love
cooking
it.
or whatever. It's sort of very surprising to really take into account, and makes even more sense all the time of why the position of the cook was such a high position in terms of practice.
Yeah.
Because everything is involved.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about the three minds, Joshin, I was thinking that the one thing that I feel like cooking does to me is get me out of my mind. Because I'm right there then, you know, I have to watch when I'm chopping. Yes, I could kind of drift off, but it's not a good idea as I'm chopping something to be drifting off somewhere else, you know. So there's something about that quality too, that there's a getting out of my mind in its busyness and its stressness, and being right here. And that moment when you taste something, looking for that missing ingredient, right? It's so part of life. But how often do I feel like something's missing? But then I can get caught in the, oh my God, something's missing. And then I'm down one rabbit hole. But if I take that moment and go, what's the ingredient I want to add here? Then I have to know my life differently. I need to know what spices it up, what brings that kind of lemony flavor to it. It opens up a whole kind of new way of seeing life.
Yeah. You know, when you were talking about noticing what the taste in your mouth is, even when you're, you know, when you're not eating, when you're in a meeting, I love that question. It's just wonderful. It's a good Zen question too. I mean,
Yes, I'm going to make it.
yeah, you're gonna make it. No, you're right. It's a contemplative question. It's a mindfulness question. Can I be aware that I'm sensing the world even now? I'm sensing. But it reminded me of something that happens on street retreat practice for me. So I do these street retreats. We go out and we live voluntarily homeless in cities around the country. I've probably done 30 of these different places. And one of the practices is you live off of what's given to you.
Mm-hmm.
People give you a candy bar or you go to a soup kitchen or whatever. But I often make a point of going back to my Catholic roots. This is maybe the inner spiritual aspect of new monasticism, but I go to Mass when I'm out on the streets. I always make a point of going to Mass. And there's the Eucharistic meal, of course. And I remember as you were talking, I was remembering being at St. Boniface's in San Francisco, in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, where they open up the pews of their church for people to go in and sleep and rest during the day. So then there was like midday mass, and I went to midday mass, and all the pews were filled with people sleeping and snoring who would otherwise be living outside and unsheltered and unprotected. And I went to communion that day. And, communion wafers like nothing special to write home about in terms of flavor. But to use your metaphor, my taste buds were alive in that moment, really alive.
Mm-hmm.
They had created a setting within which I understood something about that meal, what it is to take in the divine here. But it was this multi-sense experience of the snoring and the Eucharist kind of held together. Really, it kind of hit me, in a big way. So it's where my mind was going. And then the other thing I was thinking about was we created a drop-in center at our Zen center called Gather. Everybody wonders what Gather is because all we say is that it's a community living room. And our practice is simply to open the door and to have food and coffee ready. And then we see what happens. So it's really like a practice of not knowing. We just open the door and we welcome whoever comes. And I often tell our hosts that the coffee area is the altar of that temple. That is the altar. It's like that's where like so much happens. And when you were talking about the gifts of food and sweetness, it has become very common now for people to come in off the streets from every different segment of society with some kind of gift of food for the community. Maybe it's a little bit of sugar that they got from the food shelf in town, or maybe it's leftover tray of lasagna from dinner from last night, or plate of cookies that they don't want to keep in their own cabinet because they're worried about their weight, But they bring these gifts and they're received by the community as this like sweetness that comes when you just open the door and welcome everyone, So anyway, that's where my mind was going as you were talking.
Yeah, that's amazing, Joshin, because that's the whole thing about potlucks. For me, it's this whole thing about there's an abundance of food at a potluck, right? Even because you're kind of like, oh, I don't know if we're going to, I recently went to Iftar, which was everyone bought something, and I was just talking to the people that open their house for Iftar, and there's always like at the beginning, it's like, oh my gosh, there's more people here than there were last time. And are we going to have enough food? And there's never been a moment when there hasn't been enough food, right? Which is so amazing if we think about life and we look at the scarcity with which we're living in at the moment for so many different reasons. And yet a potluck seems to just produce that. So that act of giving in that way and that we gather for is quite incredible, really.
Yeah.
If that's available on every street on any given day, then that's a different kind of taking care, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's interesting that you brought up being in the church. I'm sort of very aware of that we are in Lent and Ramadan at the same time. And if I was looking at cooking as life, then I think we'd also have to talk about fasting.
Yeah.
In terms of this metaphor. And that same thing, partly was because as you were talking, I was remembering that I broke fast with people and I wasn't fasting. But that moment when I took that sip of water and the way that they were taking that sip of water, it tasted completely different. It was like that moment of being with people that are taking a sip of something that they've given up. Oh, it was such a beautiful moment. And it was really nothing. It was just taking a sip of water together. But as you both might know, I work in a refugee camp, and every time we go back to the refugee camp, it's just becoming really dire in terms of what's going on, particularly because of funding and all of those kinds of things. But there's always this sense of deep generosity that happens in those spaces where everything is shared in different ways and no one is left out.
Yeah.
And what that means and how one does that is such a central question, particularly when it comes to food, right? It's such an incredible, I don't even know the words. Maybe there's a point in a conversation where we have to come to this kind of place in oneself where you're like, okay, how do I move past the words to what's really alive here? But being with the two of you, I'm just called to that.
If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening. I have two little reflections, one from each of your shares here. One is, I'm just so glad that you brought in the Eucharist, Joshin, because that is obviously like Catholic prasad in a way, and such a rich metaphor. And I'm thinking of stories of people who had this mystical relationship with the Eucharist. Somebody like Angela Di Foligno, who would oftentimes fast all week and only eat the Eucharist, and upon eating it, kind of have this explosion of experience. And Deepa, what you're saying about this kind of savoring that comes with fasting, how food tastes so much better when you're extremely hungry, and when you're extremely parched, water is so precious. And it brought up this memory I have of a sun dancer from the Lakota tradition sharing about the sun dances where people are dancing in the heat of the summer and fasting for days on end. I don't even remember how many days, but to survive, they put their hands on trees to absorb the moisture from the trees.
Oh, wow.
And like absorbing an incredibly small amount of water, but just enough to keep themselves going and dancing in the sun, and the relationship that brings forth of how incredibly precious even the smallest amount of water is in that circumstance. And I just think of my own life, and I'm here, I have a glass of water, and I'm sipping it somewhat absent-mindedly and just very cognizant of the way I'm not relishing just that smallest drop and that kind of precious quality that comes up around all this.
Yeah, beautiful. Wow. The tomato sauce my grandmother used to make, of course, I would smell it so intensely because we'd be fasting to receive communion on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
So we would not have breakfast. She'd be cooking. We'd go to church starving. And the first thing we would eat would be Eucharist, and then we'd come back and have this big feast. And of course, fasting, we always had Fridays and Wednesdays and Lent and all that. I think, what I hear you both saying that's really connecting for me is how fasting is in some ways like a way to enhance your mindfulness, to use that secular word, commodified word, maybe, right? Is you become very aware of what's happening in your body, very aware of smells, and You talked about the crunch of food, the sounds, the sights, right? You become very aware. And it's interesting because it's rooted in a kind of desire, isn't it?
Mhm.
And it's using this very natural part of ourselves, this kind of human experience of want, which has to, in some ways, as a spiritual discipline, be directed in the right way. Or otherwise, we feed the insatiable hunger of the world and there's just suffering. So, how do we even bring our own hunger skillfully to our spiritual lives and to the world?
Yeah.
I think this is a challenging question as spiritual practitioners, especially in all these traditions that point to the kind of insatiable desire as the root in some ways of what goes wrong and where we go wrong. And yet, here we are as these humans with bodies who, when we fast, we're hungry
Mhm.
and we desire,
Yeah.
interesting kind of paradox in there.
Yeah. I remember when I first started, well, on the many different paths that I've started on, the insatiability is just so big, right?
Mm.
Give me more, give me more, give me another practice, give me another practice. I mean, on the one hand, there's something very sweet about that. I watch that with students that I have of like, but there's more, give me the more. And then there's a point at which actually the insatiability of it, the hungry ghostness of it, if we were using a Buddhist term, to really kind of be present in that. And that's where I think there's this balancing where fasting becomes quite an important thing within that. But as I was also listening, you used this phrase, Daniel, you said, just enough. That phrase feels so important when we're looking at cooking. Just enough sweetness, just enough, like it's both an art and a science, right?
Mhm.
If you put too much spices in it, what is it that you do to kind of make it a little bit milder? If you put too much of this in it, what is it that's required? One, it's like learning and being told. But the other is of having to do that for yourself and to find that part where you're kind of like, this is just enough.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And that I think really speaks to what we're talking about, particularly in a world where we don't really have a sense of what is enough
Yes.
because we don't know ourselves enough. If we were talking about it from a spiritual point of view, we're not engaged with that being present to ourselves and our humanness as well as all of the rest. But yeah, I'm taking those words just enough away from this conversation. When are things just enough?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the hungry ghosts, and in fact, just this morning on the new moon of every month, we have a hungry ghost ceremony in the Zen tradition. It's called the Gate of Sweet Nectar. It's very beautiful. But one of the things we do in this ceremony is we actually feed the hungry ghosts.
Mhm.
We feed the hungry ghost that exists in each of us and the hungry ghosts whose hunger is really the source of so much profound suffering in the world.
Mhm.
And the ingredients that we feed to the hungry ghosts in this ritual, it's a very beautiful, profound, complex ritual, is there are 5 ingredients. Again, another list from Buddhism, this time 5. And it says that there are these 5 things that we bring to the table. So it's not about ignoring that the hungry ghosts exist. It's like, how do we skillfully, and this is to your point, Deepa, of like, how do we learn how to skillfully feed the hunger with just enough, with the right ingredient at the right moment in time to meet the specific hunger that exists there in just the right amount. And so the 5 ingredients are the Buddha ingredient, which is our spiritualities, the vast entering into the absolute, the ultimate, that we all have this experience of the oneness of life. And that experience is an ingredient. Another is our intellectual capacity. This to your point about learning in some ways. Like, how do we continue to understand ourselves and the world so well that we feed it properly and in the right measure? The third is our resources of time, talent, treasure. Like, how do we use our time properly? how do we bring our talents to feed it? What is the treasure that we bring to the table for this specific kind of hunger? The fourth is our capacity to build and strengthen community, the bonds that connect us to one another. How do we get beyond labels and categories and actually see each other with the same and equal potential for bonding around our common humanity? And the fifth ingredient is service, is to reorient out of the self-interested mind to meet the needs of others. So those are the 5 ingredients that you bring to the gate of sweet nectar to satisfy the hunger, to satisfy the hungry ghosts.
That's beautiful. It really reminds me of this book by Lama Tsultrim in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Feeding Your Demons. And it's a kind of modern practice based on a Tibetan Buddhist practice of Chod, I believe is the traditional name. And this idea of feeding your demons. And in this case, in Lama Tsultrim's book, a lot of that is, psychological demons. And in brief, it's like this visualization practice of getting in touch with those demons and then asking them what they want and then feeding them, and in feeding them, allowing them to transform from kind of demons into wisdom beings, turning them from enemies into allies through this act of feeding.
Love that.
So in some ways, I hope we would go more into the Dogen text, but this has been so rich, and I'd like to just pivot here a little bit and bring in some Rumi into the conversation, because I think, Deepa, you mentioned it earlier, similar to the way in which the head cook is the kind of number 2 in the Zen monastery in a Mevlevi teke, in the Sufi gathering house of Rumi's tradition, the Mevlevi Order. The cook is also the kind of second in command and is like the master of novices in a Catholic monastery, is responsible for the training of young aspirants. And they very famously have this 1,001 day retreat, a large part of which is the young disciples working in the kitchen as a part of their practice. Deepa, I know you have some experience in the Mevlevi tradition, and I'm wondering if you can speak to that. But before then, I wanted just to read a little selection from Rumi to kind of bring in that flavor a little more directly, hopefully. So this is translated by Kabir and Camille Helminski, and it's titled, Boil Nicely Now. Look at the chickpea in the pot, how it leaps up when it feels the fire. While boiling, it continually rises to the top and cries, Why are you setting the fire under me? Since you bought me, why are you turning me upside down? The housewife keeps hitting it with the ladle. No, she says, boil nicely now, and don't leap away from the one who makes the fire. It's not because you are hateful to me that I boil you, but so that you might gain flavor and become nutritious and mingle with essential spirit. This affliction is not because you are despised. When you were green and fresh, you were drinking water in the garden. That water drinking was for the sake of this fire.
Wow.
I love that poem so much.
Mm.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing it. I actually was involved in the process of learning how to turn, or whirl, whichever word you're going to use. And in that training, you're called a chickpea when you start. So it really is this idea that you're this hard, little pea that needs to be cooked. And the training itself is like, I'm just going to tell this story because I think it sort of shows what happens when the ego is cooked, because that's essentially the training. In the first day that you start, we have a board, and on that board is a round nail, and around that nail is some salt. And the first part of your practice is to put your toe big toe and the next one, to have the nail rest in that. And what you have to do is make perfect circles in that salt. Well, on the first day of my training, my skin, it really rubbed against the nail and it sort of broke. So suddenly I had salt in my toe, and we had to do this every day for 6 days a week. And that was our training. The most beautiful thing about being a chickpea is that there's a whole bunch of people that come to take care of you as you're training. You're training for half an hour, right? But there's a whole gang that came to make breakfast for you and would sit with you as one ate one's breakfast. And so it was a little bit like you had a gang of people going, oh, did that just happen? Well, let me tell you what you can do for that. This kind of sense that people that had already been cooked are able to come and tell you how to deal with your cooking process. Then you had that. And the thing was that the nail was just pure pain. And you're just like, this nail, I hate this nail. You know, it was literally like that. And then after 2 weeks of working with the nail, well, you came in the morning and there was no nail anymore. There was just salt. Then it was like, where's the nail? I can't believe they took the nail away. I didn't know how I can do these circles and stay in this and have my foot flat on the ground. So there's this calling out and yearning for this nail who was, you know, the one thing that you didn't want. And so it was like, okay. And slowly you settle into kind of making that perfect circle, still learning how to do that. And then you come in and you're given a stick in order to be able to hold your hands up. And again, there's this like relationship with this stick and the teacher behind you, kind of just as you have the Zen stick, it would just like be banging this broom on the floor going, keep those hands up. And it was like, I thought this was spiritual training. This is like boot camp. I don't understand. You know, and there's a hands would fall. And remember, this was only half an hour. It's not more than half an hour. So it was extraordinary, the amount of pain that one would go through for these half an hours. And as we were working, of course, the people that were looking after us got to know us better. So they got to know what we needed for our breakfast. They got to know how someone needed to just go and sit in a corner and they weren't going to talk to anyone. They got to know each of the little things that would really feel like you were being looked after as you did this process, you know. And then when you came into the room and now there was no salt and there was no board and you had to kind of just freestyle it in terms of turning and you didn't have the stick anymore. And it was like, oh my God. And when we moved from that space into the bigger space, the one thing that they brought with them, the people that were looking after were buckets. And we were like, well, what do we need the buckets for? But as you're learning how to turn in that way, you become sick. You just throw up because it's like you're just not used to any of these things. And within the practice, what you have to do is you hold your concentration on your thumb. So as you turn, you have this one point that remains still. So you're doing this concentration. The only thing that you're concentrating on is your nail, you know, your thumbnail. So this whole thing of just like then being sick, and the ego, of course, is going through all of its reactions of like, I hate this. Why did I choose to do this? Like any retreat that any one of us has done, you know, that process is just so intense of like really kind of thinking. And you're still called a chickpea. And at some point you're like, don't call me a chickpea. It's just the constant reaction to everything. And you're building towards a ceremony. You're building towards a coming out ceremony, the mukabale. So there's all of this kind of pressure on one to do it. And slowly there's like the people that have turned before, they come and turn with you so that you're not on your own. But then when you get to your mukabale, it's just really you and the people that you've been working with. And I have to say that it's exactly that poem. The poem that you just read is a complete kind of process of what it means to actually turn. And then there is a moment in the ceremony, everything is kissed, as I said. Every single piece of clothing you put on, you kiss it. And there's this beautiful moment where really the purpose of the turning is to lose your mind. So that all you're doing is you're right here and free to fly as you kind of go around. You're accepting the moment of your death And I think in a way we can see that in cooking. There's a moment that one has to accept that this is the final kind of cooking that we all experience in different ways. So I feel like just in recounting the story is just like realizing how the turning ceremony is constantly happening in me. It's like I'm there kind of going, don't take away the nail. No, I hate the nail, you know. Even today, I could probably tell you what the nail is, you know, but if you took it away tomorrow, I'd be like, wait, I didn't say you could take it away. Yeah, Rumi did us all a favor in terms of really showing us what it means to empty, truly empty, so that one can fly, that the heart has wings that can just keep on turning. That was a long story, but I thought it was worth telling in this context with all its drama.
I loved it. That's a great story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I love this. It feels like we're offering some food to each other, you know, it's just wonderful. And I notice things and you notice things, and it's like, wait, did you know that's here too? So as you were telling your story, I was thinking about my own Zen training process. And it's all very structured, and you get to the point where you function as the Tenzo, the head cook, and all that kind of stuff. And when I was Tenzo, the poet Jane Hirschfield came to the Zen center I was at and did a workshop. And she had actually wrote me a Tenzo's poem that I have somewhere. I should have brought today, but I don't have it nearby. But I remember her talking about this then. And then since then, I heard her on a podcast say that so much of Zen training is a process of learning to want the unwanted.
Whoa.
That the structures and the difficulties of it, the rigor of it, is a process of, you used the word emptiness, it's a process of letting go, of learning to want the unwanted. And this is certainly in Dogen's text, where he recognizes how very difficult the role of the Tenzo is in the kitchen. It's constant pressure. And every meal you start from scratch again, take out the pots. And at the end, you wash everything and make sure everything's put away over and over and over again. And you can only imagine, of course, the states of mind one goes through, like, I can't believe I have to do this again. Why do I have to do this again? Oh, and that same monk always complains about the rice and this blah, 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 right? And you can just imagine, you know, the inner kind of dialogue going on in there. So there's this part of the story in the instructions to the cook where Dogen, you know, he goes to China early in his life because he feels that Japanese Zen has become corrupt, bureaucratic, authoritarian, all this kind of stuff. And he goes looking for the true Zen. So he has to travel to find that. He goes to China, and there's all kinds of interesting dramas that happen to him. But one is that he has his first encounter with the head cook when he's in China. And it's an old Tenzo who's been Tenzo for decades, who's walked miles to get to this place to buy dried mushrooms. And Dogen's like, okay, why are you, this venerable old man, sent out from your monastery to go find mushrooms? They're working you too hard. How can you be the Tenzo, you know? And the old monk laughs at him, laughs at Dogen and says, you're just a kid. You don't understand anything about Buddhism. You don't understand anything about the practice. This comment eats at Dogen, you know. He's like, I don't get it. Like, at this point, why isn't he just sitting zazen and studying scripture? You know, isn't that what he should be doing? And he says it out loud to the Tenzo. And this old Tenzo says, you also don't know the meaning of zazen. You don't know the meaning of meditation or study. Like, you don't understand a thing if you're asking these questions. And Dogen's whole life, he comes back to this question over and over again, like, what don't I understand here? And eventually he begins to see that what this old Tenzo is saying is that it really doesn't matter what you're doing, what position you have, where you sit in the hierarchy, what task you're given, no matter how unwanted it is, you want it because it becomes the opportunity to practice with non-separation with what you're doing, with the work, with the world, with yourself, you know. And it takes Dogen a lifetime to kind of get it, that's what it's about. And it's through the teaching of the Tenzo that he gets it. And I think of that Jane Hirschfield line. It's like, yeah, what happens to us when we learn to want the unwanted?
Mm-hmm.
What have we let go of by that point? What separations have we released that allows us to be with the thing that we're doing, no matter what it is, no matter what position in life, what experience in life? The other thing I was thinking, Deepa, as you were talking, I don't know what got me to this. There's a concept in Zen Buddhism that I often refer to. It's called the slender sadness, which is that even in the celebration of a meal, you have to have taken life for your own life to continue. And that there's always this slender sadness there, that we live in the poignancy of that truth. And there's something kind of very rich in that little space as well, I think.
Oh my God, so rich. And such a way, what you've just done for me is open up. The staying with the slender sadness has become the only way I feel like I can show up in the refugee camp or in this daily grind that we're in, or just the level of just craziness that's going on in the world, because that slender sadness speaks to the disappointments of inequity and inhuman behavior. And it's all there. To let it have a presence in the way that you're talking about, for me, is like, oh, that's how I then show up. When that has a place, then there's a way to be present. You've reminded me, there's a line of Hazrat Inayat Khan's where he says, as fire can cook or burn, so also does pain affect the human heart. That feels like that there's a connection for me between slender sadness and the way that we use fire and its capacity to cook or burn, right? That's what pain is for the heart, what suffering is, when we get to know how to truly cook with the pain that's present, that only our hearts can really know how to be with. There's a different balance, it feels like, for me, that gets restored in that.
I think that's the subtle sense of Jane Hirschfield's line, too, is wanting the unwanted. Like, there is this suffering that we don't want.
Yeah.
And yet, let's not waste it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really. Oh, what a conversation.
Yeah. Regrettably, I think we have to come in for a landing here.
Time to end the meal for now.
There's a slender sadness here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're not around an Italian dinner table where we could go for 3 hours here.
Yeah. Next time we should do it in person, in a kitchen, cooking.
Absolutely.
While we're cooking.
The sounds of chopping in the background.
Oh, yeah. And then sitting around the table, inviting all of our friends. And we have a gorgeous meal together.
Yeah.
I have a feeling they're all here, though, even in this.
They're here.
What shall we call it? Metaphorical meal that we have cooked and are eating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow.
Just briefly, I just wanted to share this reflection on what you're saying, Joshin, around wanting the unwanted. And it reminds me of something I've heard about Zen, of this idea of the one taste. And through our attitude of relating to experience, this kind of equalization of experience, not to call the bad good or the good bad, but almost this kind of neutralization of charge, where like a good creamy soup, everything is blended together so that all these different ingredients become the one taste. So I guess before coming in for this landing, this little addendum here, I'm curious if you can just share a note about that one taste idea in Zen.
Yeah. I mean, it's rooted in some ways, of how I kind of understand it, rooted is in the three treasures of oneness, difference, and the harmony of oneness and difference, actually, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And the one taste is in some ways that capacity to recognize that all there is our awareness, right? Like if something tastes bitter or tastes sweet, that's another layer that we spread on top of just tasting. just experiencing, just living,
Mm-hmm.
just being aware. So, Zen emphasizes white rice. There's not a lot of flavor on it. It's just very simple meal, actually. And you are appreciating the experience of taste, just a sense. And so that becomes an interesting metaphor, which is like all experience is just experience. And then we start to tell stories about the experience. This is a good experience, not a good experience.
Right.
And then we develop a story about that, like, oh, when it's not a good experience, I don't want that experience. So I should then make that experience an enemy. And I'll make friends of the experience as I do like it. Another layer to the story. So our job is to go back to white rice, just taste one flavor, a world of one color. And from there, then we skillfully acknowledge what's happening in the individuated world. So to Deepa's point earlier, if the meal is too bitter, you learn how to correct. It's still rooted in the one flavor, just taste. But we're also distinguishing and differentiating skillfully, and hopefully as life goes on, more skillfully. In some ways, I also think of the one flavor, that's like a place of resiliency for me. It's to remember that I don't have to live in the place of reactivity to the bitterness. It's just taste. And can I let just tasting strengthen me, strengthen my back, open my heart? And that becomes a new starting point to then encounter the next level. Bitter, sweet, etc., etc.
Beautiful.
Feels like there's two layers here. The practice of going to one taste and to allow for other tastes, as it were, but also the remembrance of it's all tasting.
Yes, it's all tasting.
So those two together is kind of very interesting. And that's the nuance I'm taking away from myself of, it's about attitude and discernment of, is the practice that I'm in that it's all tasting, or is it the need to actually kind of go back to one taste to be able to then discern in a different way? I don't know if they're an either or, to be honest, as I'm talking.
Yeah,
but
I think they interpenetrate, let's use that
they
word.
do, but it's very helpful. I don't think I'd seen that discernment before as fully as I am right now.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
What a gorgeous conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you both.
I don't know how you'd write the recipe for it, though.
That's the thing, is we just used what was in the kitchen right now.
Yeah, we did.
Next time we do it, it'll be a different
totally thing. Different conversation. Thank you, Daniel, for hosting us.
Oh, yeah, of course. To close us out, I'm wondering if you have a little something to share, Joshin, like a poem or song or something. And I had one other longer selection from Rumi kind of bookmarked here. So I'm wondering if we can maybe, in this kind of spirit of juxtaposing these traditions, maybe do a little dual share, go one after the other. And I'll read just a small part of this selection, and then you can close us out. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
So this selection is called Buttermilk, and it's a little bit longer, so I don't want to read the whole thing, but just a little part of it here. A lot of shaking is needed for the buttermilk to offer up the butter from its heart. The butter is as invisible as non-existence itself. While the buttermilk has raised its own banner in the world, what seems most to exist is just the skin of something which seems not to exist, but is the source. If the buttermilk has not yet offered its butter, store it away until you can extract the butter. Churn it from side to side, hand to hand, until it reveals what is hidden within it. For this perishable body is the evidence of the eternal, and the babbling of the drunkard is proof that someone poured the wine.
Oh, beautiful words. So in Zen, we often have a practice of asking students to write a poem to express their understanding. I've been having a little practice last couple months of writing love letters to different parts of the world, or different parts of myself, different parts of the earth.
Oh, I love that.
Different problems that we have in society. So anyway, having asked me to come up with something, I decided just to write a little something that expressed my understanding of the Tenzo Kyokun.
Oh, thank you. That's beautiful.
And it's called Just Cook. So whether you're flipping pancakes or flipping out, whether you're cleaning up a greasy pan or holding the grief of a friend or the sorrows of the world, remember this: there's no garbage. There's nothing extra. Nothing is separate. All of it is part of the meal. Just cook. Cook with two hands. Cook with the joy of being alive. Cook with the heart of a grandmother. Cook with a mind as wide as the sky. And when the meal is ready, serve it up with love.
So gorgeous.
Delicious.
Maybe a little too sweet, I don't know.
Just enough. Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.